just general crowd noise. You can use it.
And I feel sorry for you and your lack of soul.
Ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, welcome to Circus Bazaar magazine, penned from the crooked timber of humanity. Allow me to introduce to you a man, a great Scottish man from the birthplace of liberalism itself, a man that has spent his life studying identity politics and nationalism from within Mother Russia herself. Watch as this fantabulous performer hypnotizes his dialectical adversaries by way of his skills with a punji. Feel the danger as he dances away from the inevitable deadly venom of which they are sure to spit. From the dirty bazaars of Stirling, Scotland, to the vodka-soaked bars of Moscow, and appearing within the headquarters of the great Circus Bazaar magazine itself. The one and only snake charmer of Circus Bazaar magazine, we present to you Matthew Blackburn. Enjoy the show.
Okay, so 1, 2, 3. Hello, Matthew. How are you, man? Thank you for coming on the Big Tent podcast by Circus Bazaar magazine.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So, what are we going to talk about today?
I believe we're going to talk about Russia, Ukraine, and perhaps also about how we even produce knowledge about the things that have been going on in that region in the last decades. All of a sudden, the work that was being done on the transformation of Russia is being understood in different ways, and I think it's time to have a multifaceted discussion about that.
Okay, excellent. Well, firstly, we need to introduce you. So, Matthew Blackburn, who are you?
I'm a researcher. I work in academia. I'm from Stirling, which is the old historical capital of Scotland, and I suppose it's also the birthplace of modern Scottish nationalism, but it didn't intoxicate me in my younger years, and I was instead more interested in the East, primarily Russia and Central Asia, these countries of the former Soviet Union. So I entered academia after living in Russia for 4 years. Then I went into academia, so that makes a little bit of an unusual trajectory compared to the standard academic. Different layers of ways to make a living out of being an analyst of Russian politics and society. You probably know that there's research institutes, universities and think tanks, so there's mainly 3 centres of knowledge production. I ended up in the academic track and in particular area studies, which is one particular branch of studying Russia and the so-called post-Soviet space.
Okay, so you spent many years living in Russia. So what drew you there and how did you end up there?
Well, what drew me to Russia was that I had done an undergraduate degree in history and I had read basically Soviet history. And I always thought that what happened in the Soviet Union was a big part of the story of the 20th century. But then as I understood what was happening in the 90s and what was this kind of transformation of Russia, it also fascinated me as a kind of almost like a test lab for various kind of ideas and paradigms and experiments which they were conducting themselves. So I suppose it was something of the epic scale of what was going on in Russia that pulled me out of maybe becoming a historian and being in the archives and into something else, namely understanding what is Russia transforming into. What is the relationship is going to have with the West? And on a personal level, I think I was also interested in it was some kind of frontier aspect. It was like an unknown frontier. It wasn't East, it wasn't West. It wasn't also clearly a bridge between East and West at that point. Its status was kind of unclear, but it certainly attracted me, and I went over there with the intention of spending a year to learn Russian, but ended up spending 4 years there, and probably it's what I needed to get that really deep experience of the country.
So, having spent so many years living and studying in Russia, obviously what's happened in Ukraine over the last couple of years, you've got I wouldn't say so much an alternative perspective, but you've been looking at it from an alternative position. So looking back into the Western sphere of influence and how it's reacted, what the information sphere is like. What is it like looking back the other way?
Well, in the 2000s, when I lived in Russia, I was very well read about Soviet history, and I'd watched a lot of Russian cinema and literature I had read. So I wasn't someone who came there with a lot of very, very simplistic preconceived notions. But obviously, I've come to understand that a lot of my perception of Russia was filtered through the gatekeepers of the Russian liberal intelligentsia, who had a particular set of advantages in terms of how they could disseminate their views to Western audiences, be it in the media or be it in academia or monographs or books.
Russian political technologists, as our last guest would have referred to them as.
Perhaps that's a branch of it, but less so, I would say. It's more the cultural intelligentsia. It's the people that write about historical memory, the Soviet past, then the way that civil society is developing, how democratization should proceed, and most importantly, how to interpret the Putin system that was developing in the 2000s, and the way that they, eventually what I came to notice was they rather savagely and polemically were attacking the Putin government on any issue. They would have a frame that was extremely hostile. And I could see how that framing then would get translated back to the West. But when I was in Russia talking to Russians of different backgrounds and different ages and different professions, I could see that they didn't share any of this framing that the Russian liberals had. So that meant that, well, essentially, I felt there was a big gap. And I suppose that was the imperative I had in wanting to try and somehow be a bridge of that gap, so that the two sides could talk, which of course now seems like a fantasy that should be able to happen now because this rupture has occurred. But I could see that there was potential for that rupture decades prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 or 2014. There was all of the parts were there, but I think I rather naively assumed that there wasn't going to be an appetite to drive it to a final conflict point on both sides. For a variety of reasons. That's what I thought, and I've been proven wrong, very sadly, I suppose, tragically.
Yeah, well, it's got a lot worse than I think a lot of people believed it would. Look, you've written an article for the latest edition of the magazine entitled "Forever We Stand with Ukraine," and you've been very critical of Western media depictions of the conflict. Let me just quote a line from the article. You write, "You've encountered a remarkable spectrum from extreme left anti-fascists, environmentalists and woke activists to based conservatives, populists and libertarians. Their unity is founded on a simple black and white moral position that has proven durable." What is that moral position that's proven so durable, and why?
Well, it's a consensus on Russia as a bad actor. Russia is a bully. Russia's an aggressor. Russia's to blame for everything. And by implication, we're the good guys. Now, that didn't happen all of a sudden out of nowhere in February 2022. There is a backdrop that goes all the way back to perhaps 2007, perhaps 2012. It depends which media space you're looking at. But you see this kind of trend whereby those that are on the right and those that are on the left hate Putin, but for different reasons. So that already was developing, and that's something that you that I was questioning when I was reading the Guardian articles that were very critical of the Putin government, and then I was looking at the Daily Telegraph and finding they had their critical articles. So for you, how did they end up with the consensus of Russia as a bad actor? And this is very much a case of fundamental attribution bias. It's when one side says we do what we do because we have good aims. It might not work out, but we did our best. Whereas they do what they do for bad aims. They're malicious and they're spiteful and they're lying. So this kind of thing starts to develop, and this distrust of Russia as a state, essentially, with that consensus from both sides. So that was already there, and there was also this kind of context of falling confidence in a Western-led rule-based order, which I think is partly to do with with the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the sense that there are no rules, the financial crisis. And then, of course, Russia does step forward and start challenging the West faster than any other country in the system. So, it becomes quite a convenient way to talk about why things are not materializing according to the sort of schematic vision of global liberalism or global governance or progress that was sort of, this end of history kind of way of seeing how things would develop. So obviously it doesn't work out that way. And the easiest way to explain that is we have these bad actors, these illiberal actors. They're ruining it for all of us. They're liars, they're cheats, they're thieves, they're murderers, they're kleptocrats, and we're the good guys, which of course ends up, as far as I've observed, the op-eds and the reports and editorials about Russia, increasingly it's like an echo chamber, and this kind of group of like-minded people have come up with a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy about Russia, that they are a bad actor. It's often, maybe a little bit, it's, you make a metaphor of, if you can imagine a group of social workers sitting around talking about a troublesome teenager, and they all come to the conclusion that this teenager is dreadful and can't be helped and will surely become a murderer when they grow up. And then, long and behold, they grow up and they murder someone, and they say, well, I'm so shocked. Well, not really, because the diagnosis that was made and the kind of fundamental attribution bias that was there, it almost looks like the kind of thing you would find in a divorce, where you've got like a couple that used to have a certain view of each other, and it flips on both sides, it flips, and they have that attribution bias, which makes dialogue impossible. So that's all going up before 2021, when there's this Russian military build-up on the border of Ukraine, and the newspapers are talking about it like, will they invade or will they not invade, and surely they won't invade, and surely not, and the Pentagon is saying they will invade, and it's this kind of I found it rather surreal to sort of observe, and I thought, is this going to happen or not? Is it something you take seriously? Is it really going to work out this way? And it was kind of strange to find yourself in February 2022. It is happening, and this kind of Rubicon has been passed. And then the hysteria that comes out of it, as if this comes out of nowhere, as if there's no preceding story, as if there's no context that we could look back and say, well, this is the way it was going. You had the Minsk Accords, you had these different moments that were not resolved, and this is how it's happened. So, yes, overall, the consensus that I find, that moralistic aspect of it, is something that I've noticed in very sort of thickly painted terms since February 2022, very intensely kind of expressed. And social media no doubt plays a role in intensifying that. But it's possibly only half of the consensus, that consensus is there with the moralistic element, but there is also a kind of war optimism element to it too, which has been sustained, where it's very much an optimistic view that this war can be won and Ukraine will win, and our triumph will herald the dawn of a great new age for Western civilization. It's not always said in precisely those terms. But if you look at a lot of the statements that come out of the prominent leaders of the EU or NATO or the Washington DC, you'll find these kind of statements being made, that it's going to happen. We will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. What is how they said it. After the beginning of 2023, they started to say for as long as it takes. In the beginning, it was forever, we stand with Ukraine. That was the title of the article, was kind of interrogating that. How deep is our commitment to Ukraine and what is it based on? So, yeah, my conclusion was that looking at the way that the discourse is being used, and there's been heavy, performative aspect of that, where you have Western leaders and Zelensky occupying the same stage and making these very big statements. But yeah, I think that it has mainly been sustained across the political spectrum with this very simple moral idea that if you have a defenseless, innocent child playing in a schoolyard, and along comes a bully who smashes them over the head and tries to steal their things and perhaps even do horrible things to their body, then surely it's a straightforward matter. It's an open and shut case.
You seem to take issue with the contradictory nature of Western domestic political opinion that is pretty vehemently anti-nationalist and anti-patriot in recent years, yet extremely willing to engage in what you call patriotism and nationalism by proxy when it comes to Ukraine. So explain that term.
Well, it's a term that I have not really seen anywhere else, and it kind of just came into my head when I was writing the article, and I thought, well, it seems to describe something, so let's go with that. Why would I use it? Because when the Western countries have had previous kind of military interventions in other countries, usually if it gets serious enough, then we put our own ground troops there, and it's our troops that are dying there, and so it's our sacrifice, and it's for our country, for the interests of our country. So it's been that kind of thing that I'm very familiar with the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and so, I remember growing up when watching films and reading books that were very much anti-war and had very much taken this consensus of the 1960s that it's unacceptable to ask citizens to die for a war that's not really about anything that existential. It's not really that important. It could be negotiated to a settlement. It's not necessary to die for this war, and it's really just immoral and unfair to ask citizens to go and die for that reason. So, after the Vietnam debacle, it became clear that, these kind of wars wouldn't happen, or they'd be very costly and very likely to end in failure of your democratic state. So that's why when I was looking at the outbreak of war in Ukraine in February 2022, or should I say the escalation of it, I couldn't understand this sort of gung-ho militarism that I could see. It's kind of like more weapons, more escalation. We can thrash these Ruskies, essentially. But the other element of it was this kind of way that the Ukrainian dignitaries and Zelensky himself were treated as if they were dignitaries of the state that invited them, almost, and elevated to quite a kind of high position, and where they would get minutes of silence or rounds of applause or medals or all these open audiences in the parliament and so on and so forth. And then Ukraine flags being put everywhere. That was the other kind of element of it. So you've got this kind of sense that we're very patriotic for the Ukrainians and we're cheering them on. So that just kind of ties into this idea that there is a kind of vacant space that has been emptied that used to be filled in Western societies by myths, patriotism, religion, these bonds of collective consciousness that have, in various ways, have been assailed primarily by liberalism as an ideology and as a set of policies. And we end up with this kind of sense that I have that, it was a kind of, we join into this kind of patriotism that Ukraine have a real patriotism. They're fighting for their country. It's real. And we somehow kind of jump into it and get to experience it in a somewhat voyeuristic and perhaps even exploitative way, because we get to, in inverted commas, enjoy the action without actually sacrificing blood in the struggle, which to me immediately strikes me as less than a viable moral position.
Yeah, you wonder how much of it has to do with, let's call it algorithmic propaganda. We live in a totally different information age to exist in a time where we're obviously engaged in a proxy war, but to have that facilitated by an information sphere that is so manipulated by algorithms. I have two articles that were published in the magazine, one on looking at proxy war in the digital age and one to do with the smartphone in regard to modern warfare. So in that spirit, do you think what we're discussing here is a fundamental change to proxy war? Or do you think, how do you think the smartphone and the digital technologies play into this?
Well, this is a very difficult one to try and disaggregate the different causal factors in what allows us to engage in these orgies of moral certitude and kind of crusading spirit, when it's clear that was much harder to create in the sort of 80s, for example, when we didn't have social media. We just had the network TV, and it took more time to sort of generate the critical mass where public opinion has such a strong consensus behind a moral proposition. For example, the Iranian hostage crisis, or that happened after the Iranian Revolution and the American hostages, took years to really pull together the kind of Ayatollah kind of sentiment. Whereas today it seems it can be done in about 5 days. Just requires a few viral images and a few very shocking moments to be kind of played out in a certain way. So, from the point of view of those who, advocate or launch or sustain proxy wars, there's absolutely no doubt that they take that into account, the centrality of information warfare to the strategists who are involved in these kind of wars. It's a key lesson to draw from Vietnam, that you have to minimize casualties, you have to manage fatigue. But in the age of the smartphone, it's also necessary to sort of smoke out the most dangerous dissidents and silence them or discredit them or embarrass them into sort of getting out of the information space, or simply don't invite them, mark them out and brand them so that they would never be invited to BBC or CNN or anything like that. So, yes, it's hard to... I think you have to be somewhat blind or in denial not to see that the security state of, for example, the UK is very active in the informational sphere, and that is something that they offer as their kind of unique selling point. For example, Britain is good at this. Britain's good at informational warfare. And so I think, but, to sort of put what I've said and just kind of finish the point, this proxy war is rather different and in some ways an experiment. It can't be categorized easily as a rehash of the Vietnam War or the Iran-Iraq War, which was also, for America, a strange proxy war where they backed, in the end, both sides to continue fighting each other. But this is something different. And I think the one thing that I'd want to throw in there, which you maybe missed, is that there is a genuine sense amongst perhaps not the average European or Westerner, but certainly I hate to use this term, metropolitan elites of Europe, that Ukraine is one of us, and they made their choice to join us, in inverted commas, in 2014, and it was brave and it was a remarkable moment. And I do remember 2014, people very emotionally sort of saying, yes, fantastic that Ukraine I want to join the West. And what Russia is doing to stand in the way of Ukraine it's abhorrent, it's awful. Again, the moralistic language coming in. It's barbaric, it's backward, it's retrograde. So that is part of it. So if that didn't exist, this kind of proxy war couldn't be conducted. If you were to try and do something similar in Yemen, where there is no interest, there is no connection, you couldn't. And of course, the Yemenis are not white with blue eyes. So there's these elements of it, which I'm sure I'm not the first person to mention. That's what gives a particular flavour, the particular essence of this proxy war is rather different. Now, even calling it a proxy war is, dangerous in a way, because then you're labelled, if you call it a proxy war, then you're taking it.
It clearly is.
Well, how could we say that it's not a proxy war? Right. We are fighting by proxy. Ukraine is our proxy. We fund them, we arm them, we do everything we can for them, and we do economic sanctions and all kinds of informational warfare against Russia. Now, the history has got examples of this before. Britain used to be the master of it. We used to do it all the time. We would fund and arm Prussia to wage war against France or the Austro-Hungarians or vice versa. Whichever the case was, because we had, of course, our grand obsession with the balance of power in Europe and not allowing one power to dominate the continent. So history is full of these kind of proxy wars, but this one, has its very interesting and contemporary specifics.
Ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, I hope you are enjoying this podcast. We just wanted to remind you that Circus Bazaar magazine is entirely self-funded and a wholly independent publication. We have no large investors or corporate backing. We don't even take government support. We would like to believe that the only true way to remain independent is to actually be independent. But at the end of the day, that is not only impossible, but it's also undesirable. For without you, the audience, we are performing to nothing. Just an ether of empty space with no life, no colour or purpose. So we do in fact survive on the goodwill and support of those whom we are dedicated to perform. You. That is why we decided to, in part, move away from the digital space and all its overzealous corporate control and manipulation and produce something real, honest and tangible. something that can't be taken away at the push of a button, something that you can hold in your hand that has a sense of unalterable permanency. Circus Bazaar magazine is the best of which we have to offer, and in many ways our gift to freedom of speech of which we will always remain dedicated. Our promise to you is that we will never compromise our principles of diverse viewpoints and fearless critique of the human realm of which we both know as a circus. So in turn, if you appreciate our work and feel like we make a contribution to independent free media, then please head over to Circus Bazaar and subscribe to the print edition of the magazine. All details can be found in the description section. Thank you for listening to the Big Tent podcast, brought to you by Circus Bazaar magazine, penned from the crooked timber of humanity. Keep enjoying the show.
All right, so here's another very hypothetical question, and I can't remember who I attributed the statement to. I'd like to think it's Winston Churchill, but it's probably not. But he argued that in a democracy, it requires, well, it's slightly contradictory to what we just discussed, but it's very difficult to convince a democratic populace that an enemy is a genuine enemy that is dehumanized and is ready for the slaughter of war. But once that is done, these type of attitudes are extremely sticky and it's very, very difficult to roll back. So once a democracy is on its way to war, it doesn't necessarily turn its back on it very easily. Now, your experience in Russia, being a far more autocratic country, the attitudes from Russia and I guess let's call it the Western sphere of influence, if the Russian leadership was to call it a day in Ukraine now and find some sort of treaty, would Russian attitudes towards the West more generally be quite easy to reverse?
Well,
is the hatred really deep, like it clearly is in many Western countries?
I mean, if I start from the first side of the question, which is about democratic societies and what effects propaganda have on them, this kind of dehumanizing of an enemy. Winston Churchill undoubtedly, when he was saying these words, was thinking...
I'm not sure it was him.
Well, let's imagine it was him. Yeah. If it was, then he would certainly be thinking about what happened in the United Kingdom and France with regards to Germany at the end of World War I, when there was an overwhelming consensus that the Germans had to be punished. A punitive peace, and it was to squeeze them until the pips go dry, whatever it was. That was very much founded on the propaganda campaign that the British did, and it was one of the first modern propaganda campaigns, and if you might remember it, it was full of atrocity propaganda about the Germans having done barbaric things in Belgium, eating babies and raping everyone that they get their hands on. The barbaric Hun was what the term was used. And that propaganda had an impact. And so when it came to the end of the war, there was no appetite for some kind of generous peace. And so that is well documented. And the key difference here is that, as was the case with Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi, the propaganda that's about those leaders in the West is, absorbed, and it has an effect on the views of these countries and their leaders. But ultimately, we don't fight a bloody war where our people come home dead from it, really. I mean, the casualties in Iraq were not that huge. And so it's not like World War I, so you don't have that kind of toxic mix of propaganda, dehumanizing propaganda and horrible amounts of death for your country. So there's the one thing. That's why I think that probably on the Western side, all of the information warfare about Russia, it has an impact, but it may be short term.
And if we get to rebuild the nation, and we get a lot of positive propaganda after the war, think Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan.
Well, to some extent, we learned our lesson in 1945, or it was maybe just the extenuating factors that we just moved all our attentions to the threat of communist Russia.
Just another point, and I mean, you would have heard this discussion before, but what the Western Allies did after World War II, or what the United States did in particular, with rebuilding Nazi Germany and turning it into a successful democracy in Imperial Japan, is got to be considered one of the most beautiful things in history. But it seems that lesson was really tragically forgotten during and after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Well, we didn't view Russia in the same way. It was a different situation because of we didn't fight a war to get rid of the Soviet Union. They demolished the whole thing themselves, and in a way that totally we didn't predict and didn't model or expect. So we kind of saw that happen. We thought, well, going back to that controversy over what we could have or should have done to sort of help the growth of Russian democracy, and how it turned out that we basically didn't prioritise that at all. And when Yeltsin started blowing up the Parliament building, we said, that's great, here's some money to do that. Keep going. So he'd already built a kind of corrupt, particularly presidentially kind of dominated political system, which was him and his cronies before Putin even appeared on the scene. And that was something that we funded. We didn't demand that they stop doing it. But when Putin came along and started saying certain things about Russia's national security interests and great power kind of narratives, all of a sudden this system was a kleptocracy and a KGB state. So, looking back, many others have made this point that there was a missed opportunity in sort of macro historical terms, and it's like we really just forgot what in inverted commas we did well with the defeated countries of Japan and Germany. Of course, there's a lot of nuances with Germany and Japan, and there's many ways of interpreting that would give the credit to the Japanese and the Germans primarily for having the wherewithal to sort of, and the work ethic to do that. But the only way they could do it was that there was an umbrella over them, military security umbrella that protected them, and there was also a geopolitical kind of, well, you might call it a geopolitical imaginary, a way of understanding world politics that said it's the Soviet menace to civilization, and you're part of civilization, Germany, Japan, we're bringing you in.
Yeah, so they had like an enemy to stigmatize. Yeah. And of course it didn't go all smoothly. In fact, we may well have a very, very interesting podcast, an individual that suffered under the hands of US occupation in Japan. So that would be interesting. So we may do that.
So you're asking about the Western side and propaganda and so on and so forth. What about the Russian side and this idea that maybe propaganda in an autocratic context is less believed and therefore has less impact because there's a higher level of trust in the Western society? So if your mainstream media are telling you these things, that's a good point, and there's some good empirical grounds for that. But on the other hand, there is declining trust, generalized trust in the West, and there is evidence to suggest that what the media is doing is actually contributing to the collapse of generalized trust in the West. So that's a moving target in the West. As for Russia, it could be argued that they have more of the classic elements of a patriotic consolidation, whereby the bulk of the population buys into a narrative that our state is under existential threat. It faces an existential threat, and we are not doing anything that is per se wrong. We're sort of marshalling our resources and trying to defend our interests, but our enemy refuses to admit our right to exist and to have legitimate interests, and under a veil of duplicitous propaganda, which is what the Kremlin claims is the Western way of operating, they say that they're the good guys, but actually they're trying to tear the fabric of our state out from under us and have regime change scenarios across all of the post-Soviet space. So it seems that, according to the polling data that I study, and that there's a lot of problems with polling data and in authoritarian societies, but it seems like, there is a majority of the population that buys into that narrative, perhaps for different reasons, but that is a patriotic consolidation that we barely have experienced in the last decades in the West. I mean, of course, take it on a case-by-case basis. I don't think there's any evidence of that ever happening in Germany, except for when they win the World Cup, which is hardly a kind of significant event in real terms. But in Britain we had the Falklands War. It feels like that was a long time ago, but that was like a little mini patriotic consolidation. But if you look at Russia, it seems like they might have decades of patriotic consolidation. And that's certainly what Putin would like to think his popularity is based on. So yes, it might be a bit different, and it may well be that this is the final straw for a whole generation of Russians. They make a decision. Either they leave Russia or they stay. And if they stay, they'll never look at the West the same way, and they'll never have a deal with the West in the way that the previous generations were willing to have deals. They'll want to be treated a different way. So it's possible. that the Russians could be less accommodating than the next group of Western leaders or policymakers who do come into contact with Russia when they finally do start having some diplomatic contacts.
Here we are talking about information war again. So third podcast, and the conversation seems to descend on information war. It's probably a pretty good indication that this war is about information in many ways. Now, as we said, your article was very, it was a strong critique of the Western media, but an interesting aspect of this, and just to speed it up into contemporary terms, the Ukrainian war destroyed COVID. And now what's happening in Israel-Palestine seems to have taken the Ukrainian war entirely off the agenda. So what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, you could have started with the Black Lives Matter, and then that happened in the middle of COVID, and it was like a mini cycle within COVID. And then we went back to COVID, then we went to Ukraine, and now Israel-Palestine. Yeah, so this is a job for the people in media studies to sort of get their heads around, in terms of what's really going on. But I remember that there was a big shift when we got 24-hour news stations and the news cycle started to work differently. And what you got to see there, before social media came, you already got the sense of issue myopia. There's one mega issue, it's burning. And what the 24-hour news cycle does is it blows into the fire and it burns the intensity up. It does feel like there's a feeding frenzy, and then all of a sudden the point comes where there's like another thing that comes along and then it shifts over. So this is something then that social media accentuates, or even, makes it even more intense, like almost like on steroids. Because the two feed into each other. Now the 24-hour news stations are picking things up from Twitter and putting it in their reports. So now the two are both blowing, air onto the fire to make it burn more. So yes, looking at that, what you start to see is the common threads, which are, in all of these cases, there's a kind of memory holing of all the context that goes before. Like BLM, what about all this stuff that came before? It's memory hold, it's just about George Floyd and the shock of that and the moral outrage. With COVID, it's like the moral imperative. We must save every life. But like going back to looking at virology and looking at previous viruses and trying to contextualize this and say, how dangerous is COVID? No, that's not going to happen. Right? So then it happens with Ukraine and Russia, and it happens again, we're just seeing it now with Israel-Palestine. The whole thing just gets memory hold. But then after that, these kind of things, they keep going, they keep burning. And right now, of course, any given time, where is the Ukraine-Russia war right now in the news cycle? And will it get back into the news cycle in the same way? What would it take for it to get back into the news cycle? You can guarantee that people in Kiev are thinking about this. Because it's part of their war strategy. Mm-hmm. They must keep this war in the consciousness and on the agenda of Western policymakers, and the general public must be seen to believe that this war is going the right way, and that the money has to, and the arms have to keep going there.
Well, this is the next question. How does this play into the trajectory of the war?
Well, the trajectory of the war, as far as I can tell, and I'm not a military specialist, but I do pay a lot of attention to it. And the problem of offensive operations in this war, in the current set of technology that's available, that's something that's become, very clear in 2023. So in 2022, there was more optimism about the idea that you could fund, train, arm Ukrainian units up to NATO standard, and they would be able to launch very complex combined operations, wars of movement, offensive operations that would win territory. And what they did in Kharkov and what they did in Kherson was taken to be evidence to show that this could be done. So just keep on sending the money and that will be done. The problem has been that those two offensives were very much based on the fact that the Russians hadn't mobilized at that point any any of their reserves. And of course, they did the partial mobilization after that. And once they did that, there was now parity of manpower. So like right now, as far as I can understand, there's about 500,000 on both sides. And they are unable to get a numerical advantage at any particular point of the front. And they cannot achieve a strategic surprise because everything is visible on the battlefield. So you start moving troops, all of a sudden the enemy knows, oh, okay, so you're going to now launch an offensive in Bakhmut, or you're going to do that. So what we've found is that the trajectory of the war, it's difficult now to produce believable victories than it was in 2022. So for the Western media consumption, the issue is we're spending all this money, but the Ukrainians can't produce a victory. And a very crude, and I again would say fundamentally immoral calculus emerges, which I'm noticing now in pundits and interviewers in the Sky News and BBC, whereas before they had this kind of sanctimonious kind of language about Russia-Ukraine war. Now they're talking in terms of, we've paid you to do this and you're not able to do it. You guys kind of suck.
Well, that's what I wonder. I wonder whether or not now that the Ukrainian war has been put on the back foot and what's happening in Israel, is it enables the West to sort of, it actually might enable both Russia and the West to pull back a little bit, well, without losing face.
It would appear that there is now some good reasons for the West to want this war to kind of be sort of a frozen conflict or kind of scaled down. But they don't. I don't see how they have any way of achieving that without making serious kind of concessions, which would be, impossible to save face and do that in front of the global audience and in front of other audiences. To their domestic audiences, it's fine because then the politicians will get votes. So that's one thing. But increasingly, what the consensus, it seems, if you're trying to sort of extrapolate based on different sources and what people thought what was going to happen in February 2022, it's not a conspiracy theory to say that the media discourse stuff is here, but the policy making discussions are behind closed doors. And what they're saying in the policy making circles is that Russia has miscalculated gravely. They don't have the capacity to overwhelm Ukraine. We have all the things that are needed to smash Russia. So let's go for this. And Russia will be gravely weakened and very likely will collapse. That hasn't materialized. That hasn't really materialized. And okay, that still is the domain of information warfare. To argue that Russia has been gravely weakened is to say this war has been worth it. This proxy war has been worth it because we've degraded Russia so much. But have we degraded Russia so much? Well, don't go on BBC or CNN to try and get the answer to that. They will not have a good analysis for that. They will not look at the real sources. So, coming back to your question, how does it affect the whole momentum of this support for Ukraine and Ukraine's prospects, even without considering the informational sphere? It's pretty clear that with new weapons and with the way that NATO is helping Ukraine, it's not effective. Providing different kinds of equipment, training in different places, it's not working. They can't make an offensive NATO power given this sort of constraints of the Ukraine theatre. And one of the constraints is, of course, Russian air power and, of course, nuclear power and this fear of escalation, which is real. And these policymakers know about it, even though they refuse to talk about it in their interviews to the mainstream media. They kind of play it down and poo-poo it. But in their own circles, they know about it. And so they have they have their parameters, their limits about how far they're willing to go and how quickly. And it's quite gradual and it's been drip-fed to the Ukrainians when what they needed was lots of resort help, lots of aid, lots of training in one go, sustained, big chunks of GDP spent on them. Then they could have taken on the Russians. And they might have won something before the Russians had done partial mobilization. But it was drip-fed, slowly, gradual. Not death by 1,000 cuts, but help by 1,000 tiny kisses, when really you needed a lot more. And so this is the 2022 thing. It didn't actually work. And in 2023, it's going badly. So things are moving faster perhaps than some people thought. I think some people thought this could last for a decade. And so nothing will change for the first few years. And this will all just keep going. But 2023 is coming to an end. And already it looks like, there's certain kind of cleavages and disagreements. They're starting to become visible. And the agency of that, the media, at what point does the media decide to become more critical of this? When you looked at network media, when it was like 3 TV channels in the 60s, it was like Walter Cronkite in a newsroom chatting with his boss. And they just decided, okay, look, this is nonsense. The Vietnam War is not really accurate reporting. We have to make a break. It's for the public interest. And they did it. Today, the corporate media, how they make decisions. Well, if Sky decide to do this, BBC know about that, and so does. They all know what they're doing. And so if one goes for the break, the others tend to say, okay, we're also going to start being critical then. Because that's what the viewers want. If we don't do it, we look like idiots. And they get the story. We don't. So it's kind of like you get the shift, and the shift will happen.
Yeah, I do get it, man. I run a magazine.
No, I'm saying
but
you'll see the shift.
Yeah, but I mean, this is a huge dilemma for me, man, because I could do much better than what we're doing by deliberately polarizing all the issues. Do you know what I mean? But there's no market for genuine diversity of opinion and squashing them together so you have like a well-rounded point of view on things. Like it's very, very difficult. So I know why they do it. So anyway, a big theme in the article that you wrote was George Orwell. You used the phrase double think behind the group think. So you really doubled down. You doubled down on the double think behind the group think. So explain that.
Well, I mean, Orwellian language is often understood as being sinister or evil, when in fact Orwell had, copious experience working in the media of the time, in the BBC during the wartime, during Britain during the war. And so he had a lot of experience and insight into how mass media worked then and how public opinion could be manipulated. And in fact, 1984 in some ways, was pulling together some of the common sense observations that were made by a wide range of people in the 30s, be they Nazis or Freudian analysts or whoever, ad men, advertising agencies and things like that. So, it's the point of our Orwellian kind of that kind of Orwellian languages is that it's very easy to tap into sort of tribalistic religious component of good and evil and salvation and redemption, and that the enemy is not human, and this atrocity propaganda, and that yesterday's friends are now our mortal enemies, and vice versa. We've always been at war with Eurasia, is one of the quotes from 1984, and you get this 2 minutes of hate so that you can vent all this anger and all this kind of frustration at the mess and the misery and the sordidness of the society you live in.
And much of what is articulated in the poster behind you.
Indeed. Very well done. Very well done. So the key thing that Orwell wanted to say was that in a totalitarian society, doublethink can never be exposed, and those who expose it must be destroyed, but not just destroyed, they want to be reprogrammed. And that's the entire book, really, about that. They even lure someone in to talk about how they can see through the lies, only to pull them in to the structures and thrash, torture, restructure, stamp on his head until the main character at the end of the book is what he is. Now, this could be done in the USSR with radio and with a semi-literate population that isn't urbanizing, and with the tools of state repression that were then available, and the organizational apparatus of a party that aspired to have a cell in every single part of society. So Orwell knew about the USSR. But when we come to the current day and we find these parallels with how propaganda happens in the West, and what Orwell wrote about, it comes back to one of the fundamental things that Orwell was worried about. which was the convergence of the liberal democratic societies and the so-called totalitarian societies. They end up doing the same thing, and we end up with a forever war and a permanently militarized society. Now, it might seem that we're very, very far away from that in the West, and that this is all kind of hyperbole, and for me to use these terms like doublethink or, all the rest of it. But there is undoubtedly a kind of system of information production that is ostracizing, discrediting, and marginalizing those who try to expose doublethink. I could give a lot of examples, but in the article I do point to a few things that I think are doublethink in a way. It's number one is about the interpretation of Russia being a huge threat to Europe. Its tanks will roll over, it'll gobble up one country after another. It's a steamroller, it's a juggernaut. But then at exactly the same time, we have constant repetition of the idea that Russia is a chaotic mess of a country. They can't even, sorry to be crude, they can't even wipe their own bums after they've gone to the toilet. I mean, they can't run an army, they can't wage a war, they can't run an economy, they don't know how to do anything, they're corrupt, they're backward, they're barbaric. These kind of things.
I'll make a reel out of that.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
Joking.
But they kind of, all of this stuff, it doesn't fit together. I mean, either they are chaotic gas station with nukes that can't do anything, therefore why we don't have to worry about them. We're doing fine. We're exhausting them in Ukraine, and so we don't have to escalate. In fact, just or they're this kind of great threat. So that's doublethink, and to sort of try to attempt to get someone to sort of answer that and say, well, please fix that for me, fix that contradiction. Acknowledge that it's bullshit, acknowledge that it doesn't fit together. It's very hard to do that in the current kind of mainstream media. The coverage doesn't really seem to want to get into that. And then, of course, the second kind of doublethink, I mean, you might disagree that this is doublethink, but it's that, we stand with Ukraine and we believe in them as a model of democracy, and we're patriots of Ukraine almost, and we have all this kind of... But our boys don't go to die there. No single person should ever die from us. Donbass is not worth that, it seems. And, we'll send weapons, we'll do sanctions, and we'll talk a lot, but it's the Ukrainians that die. And that's perfectly fine. And that feels like maybe it's not doublethink, it's just a really big contradiction, like morally, like what's that? And the last one is just about this thing about the threat of nuclear war, which is perhaps the most alarming, given that we just had this year of this film coming out about the maker of the atomic bomb and his moral kind of dilemmas or whatever else. The people went to watch that, but they didn't seem to connect up the dots. That we are in this kind of really strange Dr. Strangelove moment where we're on the one hand saying, there's not going to be a nuclear confrontation here, and this is just, a lot of nonsense. But at the same time, it's obvious that we are, the Western kind of governments, and are being cautious about how much aid and what they do in Ukraine, because they're afraid of going overboard to the point where it could really become a direct NATO-Russia conflict. Yeah, we can support Ukraine, but we can't really let them win. There you go.
The terms of engagement are so weird. I mean, Russia can attack Ukraine. Ukraine can defend itself, but it can't attack Russia.
Right. So there we go.
This is
fine. So then we go back to Orwell 1984. If you go back to that book and you say, what was those regimes, those different regimes, what were they what was the truth they were hiding behind the doublethink? The truth was that those regimes require forever wars to sustain their mode of existence and their legitimacy and the structure of the society. If war ended, then they wouldn't know what to do with themselves. Now, coming back to this thing, what does the doublethink conceal behind what is the real purpose of the war in Ukraine from the point of view of the people who are in the security state in the West? I'm not going to answer it, but we could speculate. But
my next question requires a little bit of context. Obviously, what we see here globally is the post-Cold War vision of a liberal international order backed by US unipolarity, and then we see a theoretical vision on behalf of the non-aligned states, China, Russia, Iran, for example, that envision a multipolar world going into the future. And then you have these middle ground states. And then within states that are on the unipolar side, you have political parties that are envisioning the future as being multipolar, and so they're hedging their bets.
Now, the interesting thing is, I watched an interview on Russian news, actually, with a foreign policy advisor to the Alternative to Germany party. Now, not to say that I agree with his prescription for the matter at all, but his geopolitical analysis was far more accurate than anything you'd hear on the liberal left. He argued that Germany deserved its rightful place at the seat of international nations in a just multipolar world order. So what I'm saying is, do you think, excluding Alternative for Germany and other right-wing parties that I believe have got the geopolitical analysis correct, yet the prescription incorrect, do you think the rest of the Western world is oblivious to the dynamics that are happening internationally, or are they acting out of realpolitik to propagate the idea that we just need to defeat Russia to the respective nations?
Oh, so there's several elements of that question I could try to deal with. The first thing, yeah, it's a good question, but the first thing about the discourse of multipolarity as opposed to a discourse on unipolarity. Now, I think that if you were to look very carefully across the statements and policy sort of outputs of the West, of the USA, of the EU member states, the EU itself, and NATO, you wouldn't find that explicitly being talked about all the time, that there's one pole of power and it's America and they're the global hegemon and they decide in Washington, we try to negotiate some concessions for us, but basically we're happy with that. They are the policemen of the world, they are the power that keeps the whole system going. It's not regularly articulated, and it's because, you could come to this notion of, what is, from the Gramscian notion of hegemony, when something is so obvious, so common sense, it doesn't need to be articulated or debated, that this is the system that we live in, this is the result of the end of the Cold War. But
there's definitely like a perception among many people in the West that unipolarity is the natural order of things. Like yes. It's a Darwinistic conclusion to directional.
As I said, I think it's not even a Darwinistic thing. It's just that is how the global sort of progress that they have envisioned in their heads will be achieved through this global hegemon who's a benign hegemon. And so, of course, in the IR literature, it's explicitly going on about using these terms, having these debates, but in the more general kind of mainstream media discourses, it doesn't really come into this. And in a way, it's almost like, on the one hand, there's no appetite in media discourse to sort of analyse what's happening to American power, acknowledge that it is what underpins the whole thing, calling it a rules-based order when it's actually a US-led and dominated order. But having that debate, it seems to not really be something that you find easily in the media, and then also that elites in Europe are in some ways dependent on that idea. They don't want to open up that box and start questioning that. They can't imagine what multipolarity could mean, and I think in a way it's not a word that they like. And if you were to do a content analysis or quantitative analysis of discourse and policy in the EU, NATO, you'd find multipolarity doesn't come up very often, and when it does, it's being used to describe what the Russians are saying or the Chinese are saying. Go and look at the Chinese and the Russians, as you've said, you'll find it's much more often there. So instead of having this debate, what we do instead in the West, as far as I can see, is we just kind of debunk what Russia or the Chinese say. So if they talk about multipolarity, we say, that's nonsense. It's a smokescreen for imperialism. The Russians are hell-bent on imperial expansion, and we don't know. This talk of multipolarity is a smokescreen for just going back to the dark old days of great powers in competition. So that's what you find in the media. But then, if you look at the sort of State Department and their kind of documents they produce, or the American Doctrine of National Security, you'll find that they do talk about great power competition, and they do admit it's happening. It's already happening. So they admit that multipolarity essentially is happening, but they refuse to use the word multipolarity. Instead, they're using the term great power competition. So this is not maybe the best answer in a way, because I'm basically saying that there's a kind of denial about it on some level in the policymaking circles and in the think tank circles. But on the other hand, it seems to be a reality of global politics as well. So one would imagine that, at some point the contradictions inside the Western informational space will have to resolve themselves somehow. There isn't as much contradiction in the the Russian state media, they've been talking about multipolarity in a very clear way, particularly since 2007 and Putin's Munich speech, which you could always go back to and watch if you want to have an overview of how they understand multipolarity. But what is it, what we have to do, those that are interested in what it means for, Eurasia, for example. What does multipolarity mean for Eurasia? Well, it's to accept that there's some element of truth in both versions. So when the Kremlin talks about multipolarity, there's some truth in the idea that what it really is about for them is recognizing their status as regional hegemons. They will deny that if you put that question directly to Dmitry Peskov or to Putin himself. They'll deny it, but they do want to have their priority, their kind of role recognized in the former Soviet space, the post-Soviet space. And so that means immediately that they would gain some kind of veto power over what Western countries or any other country would do in Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, any country that they would mark out as a kind of buffer space. And they would have these red lines, and they would have those red lines recognized. That's one of the things that really drives this kind of Russian perception of multipolarity, which, we could say looks in many ways like imperialism, because it kind of basically limits the sovereignty of the states around Russia. So the critique that Russia is an imperialist country, it does have, obviously, some elements of truth. But if you are going to critique Russia on those grounds, you must be willing to turn the argument round and look at the Western Hemisphere and say that, well, America is undoubtedly the regional hegemon there. That has its own sphere of influence, which they militantly defend. So either you're for the demolition of all regional hegemons, or you're not. I mean, you can't have it both ways as far as I can see. So there's a contradiction in the Western informational space that we're going to keep on sort of talking about how we're going to destroy Russian imperialism, and then we're going to destroy all the different imperialisms and not let any country become a great power in their own backyard. That sounds like a recipe for an enormous amount of military adventurism, interventions, and of course, like the triggering of a broader war, a global war, a world war. So, what would the world look like if it had no regional hegemons at all? And that's the sort of question that would make the people like Mersheimer laugh out loud. It's a fantasy. So if unipolarity can't be sustained, the only other two choices are we go to a China-US bipolar system somehow, or we end up with this more complex, diverse, and dynamically perhaps more unstable multipolar system, which looks like that is where we're heading as far as the evidence would be available to us at this current moment.
This is one of the things I find interesting geopolitically at the moment. We're like this real inflection point between this multipolar world order that is possibly arising and the slow erosion of the former order. So you've got, Australia, Western Europe that are dedicated to the preservation of the unipolar world order. You've got obviously the non-aligned countries like I said, Russia, China, Iran, for example. But then you've got a lot of countries that I think they're fence sitters. They're sitting down and looking at what's going to happen. So, okay. Next question. Here's the big Mearsheimer question, since this is our field. Who bears the weight of responsibility for the conflict in Ukraine?
Well,
there's no need to give a nuanced response. I'm just joking. Of course, give a nuanced
all
response.
Putin's fault. Let me just start by saying that, and then we'll move on and sort of develop the answer from there. Look, I mean, Russia and the West started to compete for influence in Ukraine pretty early, in the 2000s, and the Orange Revolution of 2005 was one of the first kind of contests where they kind of had a struggle inside the domestic politics of Ukraine. And at that point, the level of kind of interference and backing of different sides was lower level. But it was, it was clear at that point, this is a divided country. And I don't think it's too controversial to say it's a country that was founded, some fairly shaky foundations. I mean, it wasn't an independent state before. It had this kind of divided population. And, we look at all the developmental indicators. It ended up in the post-Soviet period having, the same level GDP per capita as Albania, and corruption through the roof and all the rest of it. So a fragile situation that needed responsible powers to sort of come together and say, right, okay, we could compete here, and the West could pick its side, which is those who want this national reawakening of Ukraine and this kind of breaking out of the Soviet-Russian path dependency and joining the civilized West, versus those who are saying, no, this radical nationalism is dangerous, and we must hold Ukraine together, and we must keep a special relationship with Russia because that's what half of Ukraine wants. So if you try and cut the umbilical cord with Russia, half of Ukraine is going to be up in arms. And, why did certain Western politicians and institutions start becoming so partisan about Ukraine when, if you cast your mind back to other kind of civil conflicts or ethnic conflicts like Yugoslavia, probably you can find some parallels in the way that we demonize Serbia and the cheerleading of Croatia or something, maybe. But it was nowhere near the same. And so, that's a question that I can't really answer, but that's part of their responsibility, why they became partisan, why they decided to pick a side. But the ultimate responsibility of the West, again, the West is not very specific and probably could be more specific to who particular is to blame. But when they jump in with the Maidan revolution in 2014, that's a degree of intervention which, it's a gamble, again, that Ukraine reorientates to the West and Russia's embarrassed, and that's what it's creating a conflict possibility on Europe's eastern flank. And the media discourse back then in 2014, was somewhat pro-Ukraine, but they allowed some dissenting voices in. And there was a debate. But gradually over the time from 2014 until 2022, the pendulum started to sort of swing whereby, especially after the war in Syria, I could notice the big difference then. All of a sudden it was, if you come in and start talking about the conflict in Syria and say certain things, you're using Kremlin talking points. Okay. So if you're using Kremlin talking points, it means that you are an agent of the Kremlin, or you support Russia, or you like Putin, or furthermore, you're a Russian bot, because then you had that whole Russiagate thing kicking off. After the Russian intervention in Syria, so it's like interlinked. So, the debate becomes no longer a debate. It turns into, a manufactured kind of consensus on Russia as the bad actor in Ukraine. Everything would be fine in Ukraine if it wasn't for Russia. I mean, that's the way it was being boiled down by the end of, by the time we get to the end of 2020 and things like that. So, ultimately, the most proximate Western responsibility for the outbreak of the conflict, and again, it's never going to be possible to argue that the ultimate responsibility for the scale of the conflict right now is with President Putin. I mean, he decided to do this, to launch this a military operation, when diplomacy perhaps was not exhausted, when there was perhaps more that could have been done. But that was their decision, coming back to the West, and that's their responsibility. So in any discussion of this kind, there's always going to be more responsibility on the Russian side for certain questions like that. But the Western proportion of the responsibility could be as high as 40%, depends on how you analyse it. And this is the proximate cause element, that after the end of the Maidan revolution and the outbreak of anti-Maidan protests in the East Ukraine, which is basically saying this is a coup d'etat, it's illegitimate, we didn't vote you in. And so you've got a divide. Ukraine's on the verge of a civil war, according to any analysis, really. And so the Minsk Accords stop that from happening. And the Minsk Accords stop any escalation of Russian involvement. And they stop the all-out confrontation that Russian nationalists were calling for. A certain part of the Russian nationalist community were demanding that what they demand now, which is full-on war, just like smash the Ukrainian government. It's a Nazi government, destroy it. They were demanding denazification in 2014. Putin said, no way. Donbass is not worth it. And Crimea was an exceptional case. We had to intervene with Ukraine, but we will not do that for Donbass. And so the Minsk thing is there. And I think it's 7 years of the Minsk Accords, or 6 or 7 years. And, that's where the West's responsibility plate comes in, really, because they were signatories to that. But they did nothing to ensure that their, in inverted commas, their allies, they're not technically allies, but Ukraine implemented their side. If Ukraine and the West had implemented their side of the Minsk Accords and the Russians didn't, it would be a clear-cut case then. We would be able to say it's all the Russians' fault. They signed an agreement, they didn't fulfill it, they're liars, they're cheats, they're aggressors. They're deliberately manipulating everything. But actually it looks like Merkel signed this with the Americans behind it, under false premises. I mean, we've got statements now that are coming out from Merkel and Hollande, who are the French president. They were signing the Minsk agreements to buy time. And okay, so there's the element. There's one element of the responsibility. The next element is when Zelensky at the beginning of 2021 starts saying and doing certain things, which are, to put it frankly, sending a signal to Russia that we're done negotiating with you and we're going to take back our territories, and he's no longer a peace candidate that he was as he was elected. When he starts doing that, the West backs it. And they don't criticise it in even one single incident, even when they pass a language law, which clearly discriminates against Russian speakers in Ukraine and violates every of the inclusion, diversity, tolerance manual that we operate with in the West, if it's about other minorities. But if it's Russians, then that's fine. So when the Russian military build-up, and then the final part of the Western responsibility is when the Russian military build-up happens, this is where we can start to disaggregate the responsibility. Fine, it's pretty clear that in the White House they were saying to the Russians, come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. Go ahead. We're going to call your bluff, and if you try and do it, we'll punish you. But from the point of view of France and Germany, and Macron and Scholz, they had a mandate to do something else, i.e. to think about the national interest and the EU's interest. And they did visit Moscow, and they had a chance, perhaps, to break ranks and say, this military build-up and this war can be prevented. And again, what could they have said? If we just say there'll be no NATO membership for Ukraine, that would be enough for them. They had the chance to do some back-channel diplomacy. They didn't do it. They decided not to do it. If they did have something, they didn't go public on it. And instead, when this started, they went with the standard narrative and said, this is, condemned, it's barbaric. And so you talk about this question of responsibility, is when you have a possibility to do something to stop the conflict from happening, knowing that that will save lives, that will stop destruction. It'll stop, for example, generating. I mean, there's just so many levels to this. Like morally, if you could stop it, you have to try, right? So if you didn't try, and you said, maybe you calculated, and you said, well, you know what, Russia's weak, and we can catch them out here. We can hammer them. So let's hammer them. And historians might be able to shed light on this. What really happens? I'm speculating about this, but yeah. I mean, that's the share of the Western responsibility that, it takes two to tango. And ultimately, there were things, in theory at least, we could have given the Russians. Of course, all of the things I've just said, people that are on the other side of the debate would just say, all of that is just appeasement. It is drivel. It would just empower the Russians, and they would then take Estonia next or whatever else. So that line that I've just played out, and I already can preempt what others would say about it. That it's all just an appeasement narrative, and it's disinformation, which is one of the things you hear in this kind of new, in the contours of the debate across Europe.
Okay, that was a great rundown of that. But just summarise it as best you can.
So I suppose to summarise it, that one of the classic cases of having no responsibility in a conflict is World War II and Hitler, because the West did make a significant concession to the Germans, and then they signed a piece of paper, and then they broke the terms of that by annexing the rest of Czechoslovakia and then invading Poland. So that appeasement, in its way, gave the full responsibility of the war to Hitler. And the same thing happened for the Soviet Union in some regards, because they signed this kind of, somewhat morally dubious Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which said they were essentially a non-aggression and they were sharing this kind of space. And then Hitler just attacks them. And so, it's clear-cut. That's clear-cut. Why is it not clear-cut in the case of Ukraine? And why does the West have some responsibilities? Because they have this active diplomacy, and ultimately they'll come up with an acceptable concession that could say to the Russians, look, you don't have to fear us. You don't have to believe that this is going to turn into a massive security risk for us. I mean, ultimately the Russians stop believing in the Western diplomats and the Western leaders, and what they essentially come to the conclusion that diplomacy is a waste of time. It's not just a waste of time, it's actually deceitful. It's complete lies. And all that will happen is when Putin leaves power, or whenever Russia's in a particularly uncomfortable situation, that's when Ukraine will launch their offensive, after the Americans and the British and the NATO people can finish the militarization of Ukraine, as they would put it, to the sort of level of Israel or something. And so, coming back to this Clausewitzian definition of war is diplomacy by other means. So if diplomacy is totally exhausted, then you use the other methods. And that brings us to the decision to launch the so-called special military operation as an instrument to extract what Russia wants as the resolution of the Ukraine crisis.
What do you think domestic political opinion in Russia points towards? Look, in the absence of this axis of alignment that's advocating for this multipolar world, if that doesn't work, is Russia going to be relegated to a marginalized power where their wealthy class are not sunbaking on the Mediterranean?
I mean, that's a difficult question in a way, because if you look at how do we understand what is the sentiment in the Russian population, I do have colleagues in Washington and here in Oslo that do that work, and it appears that there's a consensus on two lines. The first thing is that what constitutes the good life is prosperity, consumerism, having a car, holidays. This is what people want. There's no alternative model that is in demand in Russia for some kind of, religious society or communism or something like that. Nothing at all. So that's one thing. Modernization, you could call it, however you want to call that set of demands. It's clearly there in the polling data, and no real desire for some kind of radical ideological programs. There's one thing. The second thing is that there is a consensus in the polling data about that Russia must be recognized as a great power, and that being a great power is the key to everything else. If you lose your great power status, you slip into the vortex and you become like Nigeria.
Do you think Russia wants that? How about them?
No, I'm saying that in public opinion data shows that they support that you need to sacrifice and prioritize great power status. So that part of the narrative sticks. Now, multipolarity is a more specific and perhaps even academic or intellectual way of talking about great power ambition. And from the point of view of Russian authorities, I suppose it's a way to talk about their great power ambitions without saying the word great power, the phrase great power. So you put that to one side, and then you just talk about this idea of multipolarity. But really, multipolarity is about great powers being recognized in their spheres of influence, really. Yes, the issue of multipolarity, it's too much to say that that's Russia's ideology and that's the whole thing pins on that and they want to change the whole global order. Putin is far more pragmatic than he is schematic and ideological. He's a lot more like Stalin than perhaps more ideologically rigid or even like nationalist leaders, for example, who won't compromise on anything. So if new leaders in the West are ready to speak to Moscow with a different tone and with some concrete offers, then it could change fairly quickly, I would say. But if Russia starts to, show these signs of exhaustion, now This is where the parallel of Iran-Iraq is worth just returning to briefly. I think it was 8 or 9 years that war went on, and Iran actually turned down at least one, if not two, possibilities to end the war on the terms that they started. But they were pushing to get more, and in the end they didn't, and so they had to make this peace, and so the great lament of Ayatollah Khamenei that they had to do that. But his close associate advocated that, and then became a big figure in Iran after Khomeini's death, I think a year after the end of the war. So that's the other thing that could happen, that Russia does get exhausted. But at the moment, it doesn't look like that they're getting exhausted. But of course, they'll do everything they can to conceal that from our view any way they can, even by mixing up the macroeconomic data or hiding things about what's going wrong.
But what about the demographic data? I mean, a country like Russia that's sending so many people out to die in war, and they have such a huge demographic problem already.
Yep. I mean, that's probably what is a big part of the calculus on the Western side, to think why they think Russia are mad to do this. And they're putting their head in a noose of their own creation. But that's why this casualty figures question is so critical, and why we shouldn't expect to find out the truth about it. It will be religiously guarded from our view. Yes, we don't know. But if we were to be, say, conservative and say, well, imagine the ratio is 1-to-1. So for every Ukrainian that dies, a Russian dies, which I don't think is true. But even if that was true, it would still be a difficult thing for Ukraine to sustain if it's an impossibility to get manpower from a NATO ally. So if that's a simple impossibility, then the Russians could still do it that way on a ratio of 1-to-1. But I don't believe that's their approach, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that's not what they're doing, and that the ratio is actually not that at all. But those ratios are different depending on the time of the war and the part of the front, and these ratios are not just one number. You can and you can't calculate the full number because that data is not available. So that's what we don't know. But we know that Russia is making attempts to reorientate itself and to sort of move its trade, investment, technology transfers to East and South Asia, and to show that it can live without Europe. And of course, the Russian liberals and other ideological spectrums that are anti-Putin will claim that this is just taking Russia into a dark age, and it's back 10 steps backwards. But a lot of other Russians who don't have a microphone and are not sitting in Brussels or Washington talking as a Russian in Europe, a lot of Russians in Russia will possibly see a common sense position that what we're doing now has a kind of constructive and positivistic element. Well, maybe not positivistic. It has a sense that we are deciding our own future and we're trying to do it. Whereas before it was a kind of a quagmire with the West. It was neither accepted nor fully ostracized, neither kind of included nor turned into a pariah state. And so it was kind of like, and this Ukraine thing, not clear what's going to happen there. And, so maybe this kind of reorientation, it gives a boost to certain kind of state discourses about, why Russia needs to go here or sacrifice for this or so on and so forth. And it might be that multipolarity is just a part of that. It's just a strand. It's not the only thing. And so, ultimately about multipolarity, it's important to just say there's multipolarity. And in a multipolar system, if you are not one of the big superpowers, like you're not the most powerful state in a multipolar system, let's say you are a great power or a regional power like Russia or Iran, maybe, you actually, your interest is possibly to achieve multi-vectorism. So you have multiple vectors to your foreign policy, multiple sets of relationships, and you're not dependent on any of the superpowers. That is the optimal outcome in terms of a state that wants to maximize its sovereign power. That's what many states do that are not in the category of potential or actual global hegemons, right? So I would imagine that at some point there will be an interest in Moscow to rebalance things a little bit. It's kind of similar with the situation that China found itself under Mao, where they had a bit of tension with the USSR, and they sort of realigned a little bit, and they wanted to have different vectors to their foreign policy. But prior to that, they had this extremely ideological foreign policy that made them the enemies of everyone. And so they kind of flipped on that, and they said, okay, let's have multiple vectors. They had enemies with India. They were, hostility with India, hostility with Vietnam, hostility with... So this is and then to finalise the point, even smaller states have this kind of sense, but they understand that multivectoralism is a good strategy.
Yeah, well, I mean, look at...
Like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan do that.
Well, I mean, look at the success of that strategy. America has successfully bankrolled the rise of the largest geopolitical rival in its history.
Yes, I mean, when you look at it from the American point of view, when they're in a bipolar system, that is usually presented as smart diplomacy that leads to the downfall of the USSR. It's one of the factors. It's some smart diplomacy. It's realpolitik that really worsens the situation, the geopolitical situation for the USSR at a time when other things were going well for the USSR, like the USA's problems in Vietnam and the kind of visible shift in the third world to the USSR. But that's a different
I meant in regard to rather than make enemies with everyone, it drew China into the world economic system. And now we're faced with China as the central competitor to US power.
My feeling is that when you understand multi-vectorism, having multiple vectors and multiple relationships and trying to sustain all of them and avoiding an antagonistic relationship with any regional power, or that's a kind of idea which I think the Russians do rhetorically subscribe to when they go around the world, and they even claim that they refuse to become like big brothers to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. They're always going to treat them as equals.
Is this like a new term for sort of a Bismarckian balance of power thing?
No, I think it's just a foreign policy orientation that you would have this kind of pragmatic position that said we try to achieve successful bilateral relationships with all of the significant players around us. So from a Russian perspective, that would mean the West, China, India, Africa, and so on. From a country, if it's a smaller country like Kazakhstan, then it's more specifically about China, Russia, Turkey, for example. But not to become, and here's the thing, this is the big discourse in policy-making circles and think tank debates, that Russia's becoming the vassal of China or something like that, which is a real danger for them. But you could argue that Europe is becoming a vassal of America in the circumstances that are developing as we speak. So, that's a constant issue for any state, that it could be not hedging its bets enough and ending up very dependent on one power to maintain its economic or security kind of status.
On the topic of propaganda, in good faith, what's wrong with a little bit of propaganda?
Well, I think that when it comes to this context of Russia-Ukraine and the propaganda that surrounds it on both sides, we could start with why it's not very good for the West's side, the Western point of view. Because we pride ourselves as polities as being able to have debates and not being propagandistic and myopic and intolerant of debate. So it's not good for our democratic kind of traditions to have sustained periods of propaganda. There's one point. The second point is just to remember that the propaganda is likely to end up creating a new Cold War that could be even more dangerous than the previous one, less manageable and more chaotic, and more likely to end up with World War III, which is the end of humanity. So for citizens who are engaged and care, okay, if you're apathetic, then fine, why should you care? consume the propaganda. But if you're a citizen who's actively engaged and cares about the future of their country and maybe the continent and the globe as a whole, then having a new Cold War is not an obviously, acceptable thing. I mean, you want to question that, because once it starts rolling out and you rearm all the countries and you create these armed camps and they're on a hair trigger from nuclear war for another 40 or 50 years, what you've done is essentially demolished the peace dividend, which is what we all thought was good. So now we don't want a peace dividend. Or we do. Decide. But to be able to decide it, you have to be able to penetrate the propaganda. And if your head is full of propaganda about this tribalism and about good and evil and bad actors and all this stuff, then you will not get to those topics I just mentioned about what are the consequences of our course. Cost, risk, benefit. Sober up. Think about it. This is one of the things that really I've come to understand about the way that issues develop in the contemporary West, is that you have to wait for people to sober up from their emotional, ideological intoxication before you can have a serious conversation. And if you attempt to engage in the conversation before that, you will get shot down quite brutally. So it's a bit like being in a relationship where, where you wait for your partner to calm down before you return to the substantive issues. But while they're enraged, you don't say anything. It seems to me that that somehow is a feature of our current times.
Okay, Matthew. Well, I'm glad we could have this conversation free of any bias and propaganda.
Is it possible to be free of ideology? Is it possible to be free of preconceived notions? We at least can try.
Yeah, well, I think that just doing our best to have an open conversation, exploring all the issues we can, and taking on contradictory positions, and we could have even got a lot more darker, but maybe next time. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for giving us the respect to write an article for the magazine, and extending yourself to appear on our little podcast. So that's big respect to you, man. And I think that was great, mate. That was awesome.
The pleasure is all mine, and I have so much respect for this initiative and where it's going. So I wish you all the best, and I hope we can work more together in the future.
Yeah, well, without doubt, man. There's much more to come.